Gosh, sorry about that. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first video on AP World History with Mr. Ansharsky. This is the first chronologically, of course, talking about concepts from Unit 0. And we actually have a special guest with us today. This is Jeff right here. All right, so if you're new to the channel, remember that this is the spot to go to if you have missed class and want kind of a rundown of what we talked about in the form of a full video lecture. So welcome to Unit 0. So remember, Unit 0 is not stuff that is going to be on the AP exam, but it is stuff that is going to be important for us to understand some big ideas that we will follow throughout unit from units 1 to 9 in our normal class. This is our normal class. I don't know what I'm saying. So unit 0 stuff that's not going to necessarily be on the AP exam, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So your bell work is on the screen right there. What is your earliest memory? Very basic, not very academic, just kind of to get us into the mood of the importance of history records, I should say. God hates me. All right, here we go. So unit 0 is going to cover a pretty big period of human history. And again, it's not very important for the AP exam of knowing specific events that happen, but big ideas are going to carry over when we discuss other themes in this class. So the unit objective is basically for us to understand the origins of things that will happen in units 1 through 9. So your objective when you're doing the unit cover page is to explain the pre-modern origins of social, political, cultural, and economic structures from around the world. So essentially what you should do when you're doing the unit cover page is pick maybe one social structure, for instance, the idea of patriarchy, the idea of gender roles, political system, feudalism, you could say, and kind of explain how that came into being. So that's basically what you should do whenever you have a unit objective. And normally in these videos, I don't kind of spend this long explaining exactly what to do. This is, of course, our first unit. We're getting used to basic ideas in this class. So welcome to Unit 0. This is our first chapter. We're going to cover basically the dawn of civilization. So the lesson objective, this is what you're responding to in the daily summary. You're going to be able to explain how the ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Indus River Valley civilizations adapted to their environment. So when you are listening to today's presentation, pay attention to when I'm talking about nature and how humans are shaping their society to reflect nature and vice versa. But before we do that, let's take a look at some historiography, meaning the study of history, not events in history, the recording of history, the study of the recording of history. And this is just to provide some basic terms that we often use in AP World when we talk about different time periods. And we call those different time periods and the characterization of them historical periodization. So today we're going to cover these two time periods, and this is throughout Unit 0. We're going to cover from the pre-recorded period of human history up until what we call the classical era. So prehistory, basically the invention of humans, the rise of humans as a distinct biological species, all the way up to the invention of writing. That's prehistory. Then we have antiquity, which is the period between writing and essentially the fall of the Roman Empire if we're viewing just Europe, but in general kind of major shifts towards different empires across the world. Unit 1 and 2 is going to cover the post-classical period. We're going to look at the time period that includes things like the Middle Ages in Europe. That includes things like the rise of Genghis Khan throughout Eurasia. So Yeah. So that really is going to cover units 1 and 2. We're going to also look at units 3 and 4, well, all the way up to 9, the modern era. So when you use terms like early modern, you're referring to this time period right here of 1450 to 1750. So that's going to cover units 3 and 4. Units 5 and 6 will cover 1750 to 1900. That's the Industrial Revolution, essentially. And then the rest of AP World is the present day, is contemporary history. So stuff that is going to occur in the 20th century. And there's a lot, but we'll get there in time. So let's take a look at prehistory. And what you should kind of pay attention to is the idea of change, because there are going to be major changes between these this time period. And we break it up into 2 distinct periods, into the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. But let's first look at the Paleolithic, because that's a huge expanse of human history. For the most part, the Paleolithic era can be characterized by hunter and gatherer societies. We don't have permanent, settled, or sedentary civilizations. Archaeological evidence and genetic testing has shown that the human species probably originated in East Africa about 3 million years ago. We know that from there in East Africa, that humans are going to migrate in communal nomadic societies across Africa into Asia and Europe, all the way eventually to the Americas. And we don't really know exactly what these communal societies look like, but we can take our best guess based on current day hunter and gatherer societies. There are some that still exist today. We have theories that these communal nomadic societies, they largely lacked hierarchies. They largely lacked class, and they also largely lacked gender roles, at least in the form of having kind of separate spheres for men and women. So we have this, or even the concept of man and woman, quite frankly. So we know that these societies didn't have a complex class structure. I mean, how can you? I mean, there are groups of 20 in a nomadic tribe. We know that there's not a king, there's not necessarily a single individual who dictates what goes on in that society. So these societies are largely non-hierarchical. They are egalitarian. However, we are going to see that shift by the time of the Neolithic era. And what makes the Neolithic era so important? Well, the main thing that is going to occur in this period is the rise of settled, sedentary civilizations. So no longer do we have migratory groups of people who are following the herds, who are following the seasons. We have people who are going to stay permanently in one location. And how are they able to do that and get enough food, you might be asking? Well, it's a little thing I like to call agriculture. So the first agricultural revolution, and we'll talk about the second and the third later on, the first agricultural revolution is essentially the invention of agriculture. It is essentially how humans are regularly maintaining stable food production through farming, through advances in farming technology. We're going to see that expressed with the plow, with the wheel, with the taming and domestication of animals. And the Neolithic era is going to see the start of settled civilizations. It's going to see the start of cities. And we'll talk about what is emerging in these cities in just a second. But the end of the Neolithic period is going to see even more complex societies. We're going to have systems of writing. We're going to have complex organized religion. We're going to have monarchies and political systems where there's clear rules of who participates in government and who doesn't. So the end of the Neolithic period is the dawn of that classical era, a time of recorded human history where we have more complex social divisions, where we have class, where we have gender roles. And this is just a map. You might have seen it in Human Geo, anything like that. This is basically estimates of when humans migrated where. So by about 12,000 years ago, we have the humans settling all the way down here in South America. They're moving across the Bering Strait right here down into North and South America. But what makes the Neolithic and start of the classical period unique? What is so cool or special about sedentary civilization? Well, there are 5 characteristics. For one thing, a sedentary civilization has a society that exists in permanently settled spaces. So permanently settled cities are going to be a mark of sedentary civilizations. In these cities, we are also going to see complex buildings that serve, in all intents and purposes, no practical purpose. I mean, this shows that when there's enough food, when there's a constant system of food production, you can spend time on things other than survival. You can build monuments, you can build temples, you can build things that don't serve the practical biological needs of human beings. But we also recognize that sedentary civilizations have a distinct and clear form of government, that it is clear that someone is in charge. So political systems are no longer based on family relationships, they're based on communities. They're based on different groups of people who live in the same permanent place. But another thing that makes civilization, sedentary civilization, so unique is the advent of class hierarchies. And that is going to emerge largely as a result of a process known as labor specialization. And essentially, labor specialization is the assigning of professions through material need to different groups of people. Different groups of people will take on different professions or jobs. Some people will be farmers, some people will be merchants. They'll be in charge of getting that food and bringing it to people, for example. There'll be artisans and crafts workers who work with metal, who work with stone. And as a result of these jobs having distinct roles in a community, we're going to start to see class hierarchies emerge. We're going to see that based on material possession for the most part, property ownership, and by the end of the Neolithic period, coinage and money. Another thing that makes sedentary civilizations unique is that they have a form of record keeping. They have a written language, and they're able to transmit knowledge not only across vast distances, but between time periods as well. They're leaving something for future generations to read, whether or not they intended it. And finally, long distance trade is another marker of sedentary civilization, because you're not going to have everything you need in one spot. You're going to need to trade and interact with other people, whether that be through peaceful means or war, that's another thing. And I should note real quick that the idea of civilization is a little dicey. We often are talking about sedentary civilizations, but that doesn't mean that there are civilizations, that there are uncivilized societies, I should say. Nomadic societies that still exist around the world, they are no less civilized. But when we're talking about these distinct characteristics, we're referring specifically to sedentary civilizations. Let's look at the earliest settlements, the earliest areas of sedentary civilization in human history. Let's look at the Middle East in a region known as Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a part of a wider geographic region of the Middle East that we refer to as the Fertile Crescent. It's this area between Kuwait down here in the Persian Gulf. It kind of goes up until it gets to the highlands up here in Anatolia, all the way down to what is modern day Israel and Palestine. And it's in this very fertile, it's the Fertile Crescent after all, in this very nutrient-rich area, we are going to see the first instances of agriculture. And we can tell that based on archaeological evidence. And the reason why the soil is so good here, especially in modern day Iraq, is because of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These are two very important rivers in that they create an extremely fertile floodplain in which you can regularly and consistently grow stuff. However, the Tigris and Euphrates, other than being very fertile areas, are extremely unstable. There are periods of drought. There are periods of intense flooding, especially because the source of these rivers are in the mountains where there's snow. So it's very unstable. And as a result, oftentimes there's going to be a huge shifting of the natural environment. We're going to have floods that change the course of the river. But the Tigris and Euphrates region also doesn't have a lot of natural resources. It doesn't have a lot of natural resources itself. Therefore, it's going to need to trade. The Middle East is a place of trade, of connections between different parts around the world, between Africa and Asia, Europe and Asia. And as a result of this natural deficiency, trade is going to be a major component of life in Mesopotamian civilization, as we'll see. But regardless of all of these detractions, the Tigris and Euphrates are dependable in one aspect, that they have extremely fertile soil that is able to produce the food needed to sustain populations. And as a result, a lot of civilizations will emerge in this generally defined area as Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia in Greek, it refers to the land between the two rivers right here. And we call these people, if we are to call them in an ethnic kind of category, the Semitic people. And they're referred to by different names, or there are different civilizations, distinct civilizations that occupy this same area. You have the Sumerians, you have the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Akkadians. We have the ancient Israelites that also emerge from here. We'll talk about them a bit more in chapter 3. And in this area, we mostly are going to see city-states. We are mostly going to see political systems that mostly just comprise a city and its surrounding territory. And it's for these reasons, it's for this prominence of city-states that a lot of these civilizations get their names. I mean, the Babylonians, you can guess where they're from. They're from Sumer. No, I'm just kidding. They're from Babylon. The Akkadians from the city of Akkad, and Sumer from for the Sumerians. So a lot of these cities are going to be very densely populated places. It's no surprise that some of the highest populated areas in world history at this point are right here in ancient Mesopotamia. Babylon is one of the largest cities ever for much of human history. And these city-states eventually are going to form more complex systems of government. We are going to see the rise of what we call territorial kingdoms. And essentially, a territorial kingdom is moving from beyond just a city-state. It's a multi-city territory that is ruled over by a monarch, a king. And there are some reasons why we start to see this trend emerge in Mesopotamia initially. For one thing, we're going to have the idea of class hierarchy being very natural and coming very natural as a result of specialized labor. You have different professions. Therefore, you're going to have some people saying, hey, I have a more important position in society than you. I should be in charge of society. But, multiple people probably shouldn't be in charge. Let's just make one person the king of everything. So we're starting to see systems of class that are emerging from specialized labor. And that's making the idea of class a natural thing, a seemingly natural thing. So it's only natural that we have somebody who rules over everybody. So class hierarchy is a major reason why people don't really question, well, some people don't really question why we have rule by one person, by a monarchy. But there's also the material need for an organized system to maintain stuff that keeps people happy. In order for us to get the natural resources we need to have roads, we need to have infrastructure. But we need to have these roads be safe. We need a military. But who's going to be in charge of organizing these things? Who's going to be in charge of building the roads, of maintaining a military? We need government. And how do we best govern? We best govern through the rule of one person. So in order to foster trade and in order to have stable access to natural resources, we're starting to see the rise of centralized government. And as a result of the rise of kingdoms, of territorial kingdoms, we're going to start to see complex ways that people organize their political societies. We are going to start to see the invention of legal systems, the invention of legal codes, laws that make society work. And the most famous example is the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king. He lived in probably 1700 BCE in Babylon. And he is going to, based on the record, produce a set of laws that govern what political and society, what it looks like, based on a shared system of agreed upon legal ideas. The Code of Hammurabi is going to have a rule for everything. I mean, literally everything. If you slap your parent, the punishment is getting your hands cut off. If you are found guilty of building a, if you're a builder and you build a bad house and it falls down and kills somebody, the builder would be killed. So it's setting a standard of laws that everyone in society are ostensibly supposed to follow. It's creating order in these early societies. Hey, how do we know what the rules are? Well, I wrote them down here on this clay tablet. But as a result of having organized government, we are going to start to see systems emerge that are much more stable and dependable. We start to see government creating the means by which to build infrastructure, not just things like roads and bridges, but also irrigation. So as a result of infrastructure increasing, we're seeing more food being produced, we're seeing it easier to transport those foods, those foodstuffs. That's a word, look it up. So trade is increasing as a result of more centralized government. But another thing that is emerging alongside organized government is organized religion. So organized religion essentially is a system of religious belief in which there is a clear order of who is in charge, oftentimes a priest, a high priest, being in charge of organized religion. An organized religion is going to be something that continues to this day. I mean, you think about, say, the Catholic Church. That's an organized religion. There's a clear set of what do we believe in, and there's a guy in charge of everything, Papa Francis. So religion is not only going to kind of codify organized religion is not only going to codify social and cultural beliefs, but it's also going to be heavily utilized by these new monarchies to provide explanation for why they should be in charge. And this idea is known as divine right. God, or the gods in this case, they said they wanted order in this world. So they gave me absolute power to rule over everyone. This is basically the idea of divine right. And divine right, you could argue it still exists today in some forms, but it's going to be a mainstay of many societies, really until the French Revolution, all the way in the 1700s. And historians kind of question, can we say the Mesopotamian civilizations declined? Because, yeah, we're not going to see the Babylonians anymore. They're more kind of absorbed, you could say, into wider empires that kind of stretch over Mesopotamia. So we could say the Persians kind of absorbed these Mesopotamian societies. We could say that the Greeks under Alexander the Great, they also are going to absorb these societies. However, there's never going to be that system of independent city-states like we saw in earlier times. We know a little bit about Mesopotamian society. We actually know a lot because of all the records they kept. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. But we know that they do have a complex, organized religion with a system of beliefs, with shared narratives and stories, with temple and monument organization. So the religion of ancient Mesopotamia is polytheistic, meaning that there are multiple gods. It is animistic as well. And animism means that there is a spiritual or divine force associated with inanimate objects or big ideas. For instance, there's a god of love. There's a god of the sun, praise the sun. There's a god of the rivers, that sort of thing. But as a natural explanation for the world, why do the rivers flood so much? Well, it must be because the gods are angry at us. It's no surprise that a lot of civilizations have a shared narrative known as the flood narrative. It's a way to explain why things happen. Why do natural disasters happen? In an era before standardized logic and science, this makes sense. So in order for these natural forces to be controlled, you need to make the gods happy. You need to make it so they don't burn down your house after a lightning storm, so that your crops aren't flooded. So in order to appease the gods, you need to, well, give them something. You need to make statues. You need to build monuments. So as a result of this desire to appease the gods, we're seeing the advent of more organized systems of belief, but we're also seeing monuments being built. And one of the main kind of monuments that ancient Mesopotamia would build is a structure known as the ziggurat. It's essentially kind of a tiered pyramid that is very commonplace in ancient Mesopotamia. It's a temple often dedicated to a single deity who is a part of a much wider pantheon of deities. So not only do we see physical evidence of how religion is impacting art, but we also see that in literature as well. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the earliest pieces of literary writing. It was made for culture, and it tells the narrative of the semi-fictional king of Sumer, I believe, by the name of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is going to go on this big old journey. He meets up with the gods at one point. So we're seeing how religious themes are often inserted into works of art. That's a continuity throughout human history. So we see this first with things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll see this as far as, say, the Renaissance, if we're using Europe as an example. We know that society in ancient Mesopotamia was extremely class-based. We know that it was based on what you owned, property, land, but also whether or not you were a free person or an enslaved person. Slavery was a big thing in ancient Mesopotamia. So we have a clear hierarchy based on that specialization of labor. On top, we have the people who rule, the king and his government. We have the priests, the people in charge of religion. We have scribes. And scribes are an interesting part of this social class because it shows how education is limited to a select group of people. And more often than not, they're the people with the most land, the most money. We have merchants and artisans, people who have a specialized trade. Then there's farmers, then there's slaves on the bottom. So it's a very class-based society, but it's also a very gendered society. We are going to see strict gender roles that are starting to emerge. Women are supposed to not be in public. Women are supposed to be, well, baby makers, essentially. Men do all the cool things. Well, I mean, not that baby making, well, more accurately, the baby birthing. I don't know. Anyway, what other things are emerging from ancient Mesopotamia? Well, let's look at technology. And this is going to show how Mesopotamians are going to interact with their natural environment. The necessity of needing to produce things from the environment is going to lead to invention. For one thing, bronze working is going to be something that reflects how human beings are viewing their natural environment as something that provides materials for them. We are seeing the advent of metalworking as a result mostly of trade. Mesopotamia doesn't have a lot of copper and tin. They need to get it from other places. And when they get it from other places, they're able to make it into an alloy known as bronze. Bronze is important because it has two applications. Military application, you can make pointy thing with it and stab people, but also agricultural use. You can tip your plows with metal rather than stone, rather than wood. So as a result of bronze working, we're seeing more efficient agriculture and more efficient ways of killing people. Speaking of agriculture, if we're going to take the killing people out of the equation, we're seeing advances in that regard that are showing how humans are using the natural environment to produce as much food as possible. For one thing, the plow is going to be utilized in order to plant as many seeds as possible. We're going to see how water is being manipulated in order to irrigate large portions of Mesopotamia. We have the water wheel, which essentially brings water to a higher elevation. We have levees, which basically control flooding. And we also have a system of irrigation known as the Quinault system. And you can see an example of that up here. That's essentially kind of canals that are made in order to move agriculture away from just the riverbanks further and further away from the river. You can spend much more land. You can utilize more land, I should say, for agricultural work. Another major advancement during the Mesopotamian civilizations is the advent of writing. Writing is going to be an extremely important phenomenon that occurs first in ancient Mesopotamia. The writing system that the Mesopotamians have is something known as cuneiform. You can see an example of that right here. But why is writing so important? Well, for three reasons. For one thing, it preserves culture. We're able to produce literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh, but we're also able to pass down scientific knowledge so as to advance scientific knowledge. We know what works. What can we do to expand on that? Writing, unfortunately, has the impact as well of reinforcing class structure, and we see that largely as a result of how education is so limited to the upper classes. So we have a class structure that's forming, but we also see how writing is utilized to expand human opportunities in a way. We're seeing writing being used in trade. You can order something basically and have a clear system of knowing what you ordered based on written documents. You have diplomacy, so you can communicate with people over long distances and across times. You can record for future generations. You could record for your neighbor 50,000 miles away. So government is able to become more organized as a result of writing, as a result of record keeping. We can have taxes. We can charge people and record how much they gave so that next year we can ask the same amount from them. We can take census records. We can record which king is in charge. So I have videos interspersed throughout these PowerPoints. I will provide the links for those so in the PowerPoint presentation, so you can look at those on your own time if you are watching this ex post facto. That's not what that means. If you're watching it after the normal lecture recording day. So this is the first of the review questions. Basically, how did Mesopotamia adapt to its natural environment? Why is writing so important? Let's look at the thing I was obsessed in 6th grade, Egypt. Well, Egypt is also, much like Mesopotamia, going to develop along a river, in this case, the Nile River. The Nile River is it's the longest river in the world, but it's going to be a major center of human civilization. But what makes the Nile so unique from the Tigris and Euphrates is the fact that it has a consistent flood schedule. It has a consistent flood schedule that brings vast amounts of nutrients down the river. It flows from from south to north, from Upper Egypt down to Lower Egypt. And all of this soil, this nutrient-rich soil, is going down here to the Nile Delta. And the Nile Delta is extremely fertile, as you can see right here in this satellite image of modern day Egypt. So dependable floods mean that we have a very luscious space for agricultural production, very fertile soil. But Egypt is also blessed, hashtag, with natural resources like stone, like marble, and like reeds. And these things are all used in monument building in one way or another. So Egypt is going to, as a result of having access to these natural resources, be pretty isolated. There's going to be some trade, of course, but for the most part, they don't need to trade with that many people. They don't need to kind of put it out there and say, hey, you can come and invade us. So as a result of that, we're going to have pretty stable political organization in Egypt for much of its history. And speaking of political organization, well, Egypt is like Mesopotamia in its initial civilization in that it's a series of small city-states. But unlike Mesopotamia, we're going to have much bigger territorial kingdoms. Initially, there's a territorial kingdom in the north, in Lower Egypt, and then there's one in the south, in Upper Egypt. But eventually, under the leadership of Menes I, we are going to see the unification of Egypt into one kingdom led by one dude, and that dude's name, or dudette, because there have been several female pharaohs, is, well, the pharaoh. The pharaoh is much like Babylonian kings, much like Mesopotamian kings, in that they rule with divine right, except this time, we have this notion that the kings, that the pharaohs, are literal agents of the gods on earth. So we have this notion known as Ma'at, that the pharaohs are the embodiment of the god's will on earth, and that when they die, they rejoin the gods. So in order for these gods, these men, I should say, to rejoin the gods, they have to undergo elaborate burials. They have to go through mummification. They have to have all their organs harvested. They've got to have sawdust put in their belly. They got to be wrapped around with gauze, or I should say linen. So we have mummification as this example of how religion is going to be used in a political context. And in order to provide these gateways to the afterlife, you need to build monuments like the pyramids. And Egypt is notable because of how its continuity. So the ancient Egyptian civilization is pretty much going to stay the same for much of its history. It's going to be ruled by the same group of people for much of its history. There are different sections, however, because there are some periods when there's complete anarchy. But for the most part, Egyptian civilization is pretty consistent in how it's organized. There's not much variation in its cultural understandings, in its political systems, and its economic systems. So we have a very continuous period of organized society. And this society is very much one in which the monarch or the pharaoh has absolute power over a lot of features of everyday life. And in order for this to happen, you need to have a spot where all government takes place, where all of it goes down. So we are going to see several capitals across Egypt's history. In the old and part of the Middle Kingdom, it's down in Lower Egypt in Memphis. In the later period, it's going to be up in Thebes. So having a single spot to do government, that's the mark of a bigger empire. There's also something that we call a bureaucracy. And a bureaucracy essentially is how government is done, how government is administered. So it includes things like tax collectors, it includes things like census takers, it includes officials in charge of ordering supplies for the military. So we have a very complex system of government that's able to manage a wide area of people. And the wide area of people is divided up into smaller chunks, into districts known as nomes. And you can kind of see nomes, and you can kind of see in this map right here what those districts look like. They were based on the sections of the Nile. So you could say they created a political system based on their natural environment. But Egypt is, in the end of the day, in the middle of a desert. So there's not a lot of cities. And as a result, a lot more political power is in the hands in one spot, in the capital of Egyptian society. We also have a monarchy that is able to keep detailed records through their own writing system, hieroglyphs. And you can see an example of hieroglyphs right here. It's pictorial symbols when put together is understood to mean something. In this case, this is Alexander the Great and his name in hieroglyphs. And much like in Mesopotamia, we're seeing a specialized group of people emerge in this class-based society. So we are going to start to see scribes take an important spot in society. And these scribes, they're writing on papyrus, which is an early form of paper made out of reeds. But we also have this influential political system that basically controls the economy. It directs when harvesting will take place. It directs when and how food is distributed. So we see how powerful government is in ancient Egypt, and that is something that is much unique to Egyptian society. Egypt is eventually going to decline as a civilization, unfortunately, mostly thanks to outside invaders. You got the Macedonians under Alexander the Great eventually, you got the Persians, and then the final nail in the coffin, the Romans. What do we know about ancient Egyptian society? Well, quite a bit because of those records. We know that there was a class hierarchy, and you can conveniently see it in this pyramid over here. We know that there was a system in which there was absolute power in the hands of the pharaohs, much like Mesopotamia. You have priests and the nobility, and you have artisans and farmers and herders, and then finally unskilled urban workers for the most part. But unlike ancient Mesopotamia, women had a degree of personal freedom in ancient Egypt. For instance, women could own property. They could be involved in public life. They could divorce their husbands if they wanted to. They could, and they did in some cases, become the leader of Egypt. There are a few female Egyptian pharaohs. One of them is a lady by the name of Nefertiti. And contrary to popular belief, slavery probably didn't exist, at least as we know it today, in the form of regarding people as private property. Coerced labor, however, did exist in ancient Egypt. We have indentured servitude, essentially where people are contracted for a certain amount of time, not to be paid, but you work for free, basically. But you also have the government essentially drafting people to work for different jobs in different roles, monument building, road building. And we call this government draft for people to work on certain things, the corvée. Religion is also going to be, much like Mesopotamia, influenced by geography. In this case, the gods are going to manifest themselves as major aspects of the natural environment, much like in Mesopotamia, but these gods are a bit more relatable in a way. We kind of look up to them, especially if it's the sun god, the most important, Ra, you literally look up to him. So we know that Egyptian religion was polytheistic. There were multiple gods. There was a lot of gods, and a lot of them had animal heads. We also know that it's animistic. And again, that means that there is a god for everything. There's a god for your toothbrush. Well, probably not, but there's a god for different natural ideas. And the Nile gods are pretty chill overall in ancient Egypt, especially because of how dependable the Nile is. And the Egyptians are also notable in that they have a clear expectation of what the afterlife is. And we know their ideas of religion based on a scroll known as the Book of the Dead. And this details the mummification process. It details how a soul is judged in the afterlife. So we have a lot of knowledge about ancient Egyptian religion. We know some of their burial practices. We know mummification, of course. But what else do the Egyptians contribute to world history? Well, a few things. First, let's look at science. Let's be nerds and look at science. We are going to see mathematical operations, plus signs, dividing signs, multiplication signs emerge from ancient Egypt. And largely that's because there is this intense focus on geometry, this intense focus on engineering for these big monuments. You need to find a way to express measurement. And how do you get the perfect square, the perfect triangle? You need mathematical operations. We know that they have a deep understanding of astronomy and anatomy. They oftentimes are building their monuments based on the movement of the sun. They're basing it on the movement of the stars. And when you cut up people for a living and take out all their organs and put it with jars with baboon heads, you're bound to know something about human anatomy. But art is another thing that ancient Egypt will contribute, especially to Western art. And that's in the form of different things. For one thing, you have hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are going to allow for visual media to occur. So that means painting, that means scrolls, as you can see down here from the Book of the Dead. You have monument building, you have the Great Pyramids of Giza, that's probably the primo example. But you also have statues and painting. You have an understanding of human anatomy in the creation of statues, in the creation of semi-realistic painting. But the ancient Egyptians are also going to influence other religions as well. They're going to influence people like the Romans and the Greeks. They are going to, meaning the Romans and Greeks, steal from Egyptian mythology. But ancient Egyptian religion is also going to influence some more modern religions. For instance, there are brief periods in Egyptian history where monotheism is going to be practiced. And guess what? Other groups of people will practice monotheism as well, largely basing their example on what was going on in Egypt. So here's another video kind of talking about the highlights of ancient Egypt. So you should be able to answer this question right here. How is the Nile different from the Tigris and Euphrates? How did that impact religion? And what are some advancements of ancient Egypt? And finally, let's look at the Indus River Valley. Let's look at our final river valley civilization of the day. So the Indus River Valley is, as you might be able to guess, going to largely form along the Indus River, which is in mostly modern day Pakistan. But let's take a look at the natural environment, because much like the Nile, the Indus River is pretty dependable in that it has annual flooding from the monsoons. And this is actually something we'll talk about in future units. But the monsoons that emerge from the Indian Ocean are very dependable in that they bring rain at a certain point of the year. I believe in the summer. I might be wrong. But that rain is essentially going to travel up and be pushed up against the mountains, against the Himalayas. And as a result, we're going to have massive floods up here at the start of the Indus River. So we're going to have very dependable rivers in this area of the world, in modern day Pakistan/India. However, we don't know that much about ancient Indus River Valley. We know that it probably was around between these years right here. We know that there are a collection of at least 5 cities along this Indus River Valley. The biggest, of course, are these 2 cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. However, we don't know much, and the reason for that is this, that we don't have any translatable records. We know that there were records, we just have no flippant idea what they actually said. So the next slide, I'm going to kind of, in class, we would do a game, essentially. But you're going to kind of deduce things based on what archaeologists have found. What we know of ancient Indus River Valley is based on archaeology. So these are the material things we know for sure. We know that there are temples. We know that there are, we know that there aren't any temples. There's no evidence, I should say, of temples or palaces. We know that there was a writing system, no idea what it says, but we know it exists. We know that there was a layout that was similar in all 5 of these cities. We know that it was extremely well organized and that each city almost looked identical to the next in terms of all of its practical functions. We have an idea that they had similar access to technology and metal and food from Mesopotamia and Egypt, because these places, well, I'll talk about in just a second. So we know that they had similar technology because we found evidence of things that were originally found in Egypt, things that were originally found in Mesopotamia. However, there is no evidence of a military as far as archaeologists know, but we know that they had spears and arrows. So let's look at what we might be able to conclude from this. Well, we know or can guess that based on the fact that there were no pieces of evidence to assume that there was a palace or temple, we can assume that there were no social classes. We can assume that there was literacy and record keeping. We can assume that based on the similarity between 5 different cities that are not right next to each other, that there was a unified government, that it was well organized in how it set up different cities. We know that there was a similar culture based on this. We know that there was trade based on stuff that was found in the Indus River Valley that's also native to places like Egypt. And we also know that there was probably meat eating if we found knives and arrowheads. But what can we conclude by the fact that there was probably no military? Well, that's probably going to be the explanation of why the Indus River Valley civilizations declined. So when you don't have a military, you can't protect from outside invaders. And those outside invaders, they're called the Aryans or the Indo-Europeans. So they're going to invade and they are going to get rid of the traces of this Indus River Valley civilization. So in this course, crash course, John Green takes you through reasons why the Indus River Valley might have declined. So you should be able to identify similarities and differences between the different river valley civilizations. So what's one perhaps similarity between Egypt and Mesopotamia? What's one similarity between the Indus River Valley and Egypt, etc.? What's something maybe they all share in common? But then what's different about them? What makes, say, Mesopotamia unique? What makes Egypt, what makes the Indus River Valley unique? So the rest of the slideshow is basically what we would do the rest of class. We are looking at the notion of a primary source. This is something you don't have to answer in the unit worksheet. It's more so making sure you know, more so making sure you know the primary source is. Primary source, it can be any of these things, my dudes. But why is primary source activities important? Well, for one thing, every single question you will get on a multiple choice test is stimulus based, either based on a primary text or a primary visual aid. Normally, it's kind of 3 or 4 questions about the text. About a quarter are actually helpful and you need the text in order to answer it. Half the time, however, it's just something tangentially related. It's important for document-based questions. For DBQs, you need to be able to summarize a document as a piece of evidence. You need to identify these 4 things right here: the purpose of a document, the intended audience of a document, the historic context of when it was made, and what's the author's perspective. So there are a few strategies you can do to analyze a primary source. For one thing, you should approach it with a method known as FIA. And FIA essentially breaks down different aspects of what the AP wants you to look at and analyze. So the P is the purpose. Why was this document made? For what end did it serve? The historic context, what was going on when it was made? Why might this document have made? What does it reflect about something that's happening in human history. And then finally, or not finally, but who is it for? What is the author's point of view? What biases, what perspectives do they have based on their language, based on their dress, based on their social class? And you're never going to get a straight answer for any of these. So it's mostly about making your best historical inference and then defending why you believe that is important for your argument. You can also look at pieces. And pieces essentially breaks down different categories of what you might find in a primary source. So if it's talking about political systems, it's probably more of a political document. You can probably focus more on developing an argument that's based on political structures. And same thing for all the other pieces of pieces. Hee hee ho ho. Oh my God, I hate myself. All right, like and subscribe. I think I'm done. I am, yes. So thank you for watching. Hopefully that was a good review of what we talk about in class. For those of you watching out of class, thank you very much. Have an excellent day. Rock and roll in the free world, dudes. All right. That's done with. I can leave now, can't I? Oh, the green light's still on. I'm still recording. All right. Bye, guys. Bye.